of 1935, when a ranch hand named Louis Brennan walked through the fog-covered hills of Northern California and found something that would haunt the state for decades. The air was heavy with the smell of eucalyptus and damp soil, and in the distance, a white farmhouse stood silent against the gray horizon. Louis had come to check on the property after weeks of unanswered letters. But when he stepped inside, the quiet wasn't just unsettling, it was absolute. Every clock had stopped at the same hour. Every door was unlocked. And in the main parlor, a dozen chairs faced an altar draped in white linen. On it lay the bodies of 7 people, dressed in identical robes, their hands clasped over their chests as though in prayer. Each face was calm, eerily calm. Their lips were painted with something dark and sticky, almost like ink. And scrawled on the wall behind them, written in charcoal, were the words, "Death is a doorway, not an end." The sheriff would later say it was the quietest crime scene he'd ever walked into. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just a lingering scent of burnt sage and candle wax, and an open notebook filled with promises no human could ever keep. The group called themselves the Reborn Fellowship. They believed, according to their leader, that through purity, fasting, and the right alignment of spirit, the dead could rise again, not metaphorically, but literally. At the center of it all was a man named Silas Merrin, a former preacher turned mystic who claimed he had crossed the boundary between life and death. In his sermons, he spoke softly, never raising his voice. He promised that pain was only temporary, that the flesh was a cage, and that soon those who followed him would awaken in a perfect world. For a time, people listened, because in 1935, America was desperate for hope. The Great Depression had stripped entire towns of work, dignity, and faith. California, once a land of golden dreams, had become a place of drought, hunger, and broken promises. Migrant camps swelled with the displaced, churches overflowed with the hopeless. It was in that emptiness that Silas's words took root. He spoke to the ones who had lost everything, to the mothers who buried their children, to the men who couldn't bear to look for work another day. He promised resurrection, not after death, but within their lifetime. And somehow, to those who had nothing left, that sounded merciful. Neighbors described the fellowship as quiet and orderly. They lived in isolation, grew their own food, and held nightly gatherings lit only by oil lamps. At first, no one thought much of it. California had seen dozens of small spiritual groups sprout up during those years, each claiming to hold a new kind of truth. But this one was different. They didn't seek donations. They didn't preach in public. They simply prepared for something they called the Great Awakening. In the weeks before the discovery, strange letters began to arrive at nearby farms, cryptic, half-poetic messages written in careful handwriting. Sleep is the first mercy. Soon, the second will follow. No one understood what it meant until the newspapers printed the photograph of that farmhouse altar. When investigators examined the bodies, they found no signs of violence. No poison, no wounds, only the faint residue of a bitter, plant-based mixture on their tongues. Every clock in the house had indeed stopped, each one halted at 2:17 a.m., and in the basement, officers uncovered something even stranger. Rows of wooden crates filled with ice and lined with linen, as if prepared for preservation. Each was labeled with a name. Some were empty, one wasn't. No one knows for certain what happened in the final hours of the Reborn Fellowship. The autopsies revealed dehydration and malnutrition, suggesting days of fasting. But there was no conclusive cause of death. It was as though they had simply chosen to stop living. The coroner's report listed the event as a collective suicide motivated by religious delusion. Yet to this day, the photographs from that house still trouble those who've seen them. The faces were too peaceful, their bodies too carefully arranged. It didn't look like surrender, it looked like anticipation. Rumors soon spread that Silas Merrin's body was never found. Some said he had been among the dead, his features unrecognizable after days in the California heat. Others insisted he had walked away before dawn, leaving his followers to their passage. The last entry in his journal read only, "When they wake, they will not remember the hunger." The farmhouse burned down 2 months later under unexplained circumstances. Locals said the fire started from within, though no lightning had struck and no one had lived there since. The land remains untouched, fenced off by the county, and even today, Hikers who wander too close claim they can smell smoke and sage when the wind changes. This is not the story of miracles. It is the story of what happens when belief outgrows reason, when hope starved for too long begins to eat itself. In 1935, California bore witness to one of the most chilling promises ever made in the name of salvation, that death could be undone. And if you look closely at that final photograph, the one taken before the bodies were removed, you might notice something most people miss: an empty chair facing the altar, waiting. To understand how the Reborn Fellowship took root in 1935, you have to understand what California had become by then, a state caught between dreams and despair. The Great Depression had stripped away the glamour of the roaring 20s, leaving behind tent cities, dust, and hunger. What was once a symbol of prosperity had turned into a landscape of quiet desperation. Families migrated west from the Dust Bowl states in wagons and broken cars, drawn by rumors of jobs that rarely existed. Along the highways, you could see the same faces repeated again and again: tired men in worn hats, women clutching children, and the hollow eyes of people who had begun to lose faith in both God and the government. In that emptiness, belief itself began to change shape. Organized religion still held power, but its answers no longer comforted everyone. Traditional churches preached endurance, patience, and salvation in the afterlife, but people wanted relief now. In the dust-choked valleys of California, spiritual hunger was just as real as physical hunger. Dozens of new movements emerged, each offering something different: healing through magnetism, divine voices through radio waves, and salvation through light or diet or silence. People were ready to follow anyone who could make the world seem less cruel. Silas Merrin was not born into wealth or privilege. Records show he came from a line of coal miners in Pennsylvania. As a young man, he trained as a Methodist preacher, but left the church around 1922 after what he described as a vision of the second dawn. Some say he suffered a breakdown after the death of his wife, others that he was dismissed for preaching unorthodox ideas. What's clear is that when he arrived in California in 1931, he was a changed man, calm, deliberate, and strangely convincing. His sermons weren't fire and brimstone. They were quiet, almost soothing. He didn't shout about damnation. He whispered about transcendence. By that time, California had become a magnet for the lost and the searching. The hills north of Sacramento were dotted with small communes, part farm, part sanctuary, where displaced families pooled what little they had. The Reborn Fellowship began as one of these, just a handful of tents and a shed on rented land. Silas preached the idea that death was not a punishment, but a transition. He said the human body was not meant to rot, that through discipline and purification, one could retain the vessel until spirit and flesh merged again. It sounded absurd to some, but to those who had buried children, it was beautiful. Most of his early followers were women and older men, people whose lives had already been hollowed out. They worked together, tended crops, and attended his nightly gatherings in a converted barn. There he would read from what he called the Gospel of Return, a manuscript he claimed was dictated to him by an angel who had crossed back from the other shore. Witnesses said he spoke of light and silence, of preparing the body for rebirth by fasting, isolation, and the purging of earthly desires. His tone was never frantic. He made the impossible sound scientific. The newspapers of the time mention him only briefly. A 1933 article from the Modesto Herald refers to a soft-spoken preacher gaining attention for claims of bodily resurrection. But the article ends with a dismissive tone, calling it harmless fanaticism. No one realized how far it would go. California in the 1930s was also fertile ground for psychology's earliest experiments with the mind. Freud's theories had just begun to circulate widely in America, and new studies explored the link between belief, trauma, and suggestion. But these ideas hadn't yet reached rural communities. In those isolated pockets, faith and madness were often indistinguishable. The Great Depression didn't just break economies, it broke identities. People needed to believe they could start again, even if that meant erasing what they once were. By 1934, Silas had around 30 followers. They built a permanent settlement on a hillside farm outside of Chico, using salvaged lumber and local stone. It became known as the Haven, though no official record of its ownership exists. Those who visited said it was unnervingly quiet. No laughter, no music, only the rustle of wind through the olive trees and the slow chanting of scripture. The fellowship's daily life was rigidly structured: sunrise prayer, communal labor, fasting, and meditation. They shunned contact with outsiders, though they often wrote letters to family members describing the beautiful sleep that awaited them. One of those letters, preserved in the California Historical Archives, reads, "We no longer fear death. Brother Silas has shown us the veil is thin. When the moment comes, it will not be pain, only warmth, only release. You must not weep when you hear we've gone, for it will mean we've crossed back to light." It's difficult to read such words now without sensing both delusion and tenderness. These weren't monsters or criminals. They were people who had been crushed by the weight of the world and offered one last, fragile promise that death itself could be reversed. During this period, cults promising spiritual transcendence were not uncommon in California. Groups like the Great I Am movement, the Divine Order of Truth, and the Celestial Healing Circle each claimed to possess secret methods for overcoming death or pain. The government largely ignored them as long as they remained peaceful. But the Reborn Fellowship didn't seek attention. It sought withdrawal. Members stopped writing to relatives. They sold personal possessions, closed bank accounts, and refused medical care. By the end of 1934, even local traders reported they rarely came into town. Psychologists, looking back, have described this as a textbook case of collective dissociation, a phenomenon where isolation and shared belief create an alternate reality strong enough to override instinct. But at the time, such language didn't exist. To the few who knew of them, the fellowship seemed odd but harmless. Until, in January 1935, the letters stopped altogether. California's history has always been a collision between utopia and oblivion. The gold rush, the silent film era, the communes, all born from the same hunger for renewal. The Reborn Fellowship was simply another chapter in that cycle. A group of ordinary people searching for transcendence in a world that had taken too much. Their tragedy wasn't that they died believing. It was that they believed enough to die. Even now, the story remains a ghostly reminder of what happens when desperation becomes devotion, when the need to hope outweighs the need to live. And in 1935, on a lonely patch of California earth, that faith would meet its quiet, chilling end. It began, as so many tragedies do, with silence. In early 1935, neighbors near the Merrin property noticed the fellowship had grown even quieter than usual. Smoke no longer rose from the cooking fires. The small bell that used to ring at dawn for morning prayer hadn't been heard in weeks. A mail carrier, passing through the valley, recalled that the gates were closed and the path overgrown, though he swore he saw movement behind one of the curtains in the main house. Just a shadow, standing too still. Inside the haven, the fellowship had entered what Silas called the 40 days of renewal. Every January, he claimed, the veil between worlds thinned, allowing the faithful to step closer to the cycle of return. For this, he required absolute silence, fasting, and isolation. Even sleep, he said, was to be controlled, shortened, disciplined, so that the body could forget the habit of death. Former members who left before the final days later described a strange change in Silas. The calm, soft-spoken preacher had grown colder, more detached. He spoke less of hope and more of transformation. The body must learn obedience, he told them. It must yield its noise, its hunger, its weakness. Only then can it awaken new. They said he began carrying a small iron key at all times, a handmade thing, blackened by age. He called it the Keeper's Key, claiming it would unlock the chamber of stillness. No one knew what that meant until later. By February, there were 31 members remaining on the property. They were thin, pale, and hollow-eyed, but utterly devoted. They slept on wooden boards, heads pointed east as Silas instructed. The windows were sealed shut to keep out what he called the noise of the dying world. Every night at midnight, they gathered in the main hall, a low wooden structure lit by oil lamps. Witnesses from the few who fled said the air smelled of wax and vinegar, and that Silas stood before them in white linen robes, hands trembling, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the walls. He read from the Gospel of Return, a set of handwritten pages bound with twine. No one outside the group ever saw the full text, but fragments found later described a process of slow withdrawal, of stilling the heart, slowing the breath and letting the soul loosen its ties. When the vessel ceases, one page reads, "The spirit will walk through light and memory until it returns renewed, still within the same shell. Death is the lie, sleep is the bridge." That spring, the group began what they called the preparation. They ate almost nothing but boiled roots and salt water. Silas told them that pain was a symptom of rebirth, that weakness was proof of progress. He forbade mirrors and claimed reflection kept the soul tethered to the material world. "If you wish to live again," he said, "you must forget the face that dies." When local farmers visited to trade grain, they noticed the fellowship members had become disturbingly quiet. They moved in near-perfect unison, speaking only when necessary, and even then, their voices were faint, as if language itself had become an effort. The final days of the Reborn Fellowship are pieced together from 3 sources: the diary of a woman named Clara, fragments of county police reports, and a journal recovered from the site in 1936. Clara's diary, found buried in a trunk miles away, begins to unravel the truth. She was one of the few who left early, sent away by Silas after she grew too ill to continue fasting. Her final entry, dated March 9, 1935, reads, "He says the time is close. They are building the chamber now. It is below the meeting hall. He says the old world will not follow them there. I tried to tell Mary to leave with me, but she smiled and said, 'We'll wake up before you do.' He believes it. They all do. I can still hear the chanting at night, even from the road." A week later, a traveling merchant reported seeing smoke again from the hill. Only this time it was thick and black, as if something heavy was burning. When he approached, he said he heard faint singing, low, drawn out, almost childlike. He didn't go closer. No one did. It wasn't until midsummer that a county sheriff's deputy was sent to investigate after complaints of a foul odor drifting downwind. What they found inside the haven was a scene so strange that even the coroner struggled to describe it in official language. The main hall had been boarded shut from the inside. When they forced the door open, they found 31 bodies sitting upright in rows, facing east. Each person's hands were clasped, and their expressions were calm, eerily so. There were no signs of struggle, no violence, no poison detected in early tests. They had simply stopped. At the front of the hall, seated on a wooden chair, was Silas Merrin. His eyes were closed, his face serene. Around his neck hung the iron key. Beside him lay a small open notebook containing his final words. "We are not lost. The light has folded us in. When the dawn rises, we will return, not as we were, but as we were meant to be. The gate is open." The coroner listed the cause of death as heart failure due to prolonged starvation, though some officials argued that explanation didn't fit all the cases. The bodies showed uneven signs of decay, suggesting they had died at different times, some days apart, some perhaps weeks. Yet all were found in the same seated position, perfectly arranged. The chamber Clara mentioned was later discovered beneath the hall. It was a narrow, windowless cellar lined with rough stone, containing only 3 items: a metal basin, several burned candles, and a wooden sign that read, "Sleep well, for the return is near." The site was sealed and later demolished. The press called it the rebirth tragedy. For a few weeks it dominated California headlines: another cult suicide, another strange story from the valley. But the deeper details never made the papers. Perhaps they were too strange, too quiet to sensationalize. Locals claimed the smell lingered for months after the cleanup. Some swore they saw figures walking the property at night, pale shapes moving between the olive trees, pausing, listening. A caretaker who guarded the ruins for a short time reported hearing whispers in the cellar, though when he shone his lantern down the stairs, there was nothing there. Decades later, in 1972, a team of anthropology students from UC Davis revisited the site for a study on Depression-era spiritual movements. They unearthed several small relics, fragments of pottery, a rusted oil lamp, and 1 page of the Gospel of Return. The paper was fragile but legible. It read, "The body sleeps, the spirit circles. We are not gone, we are only between." After that, the site was closed permanently. The hill remains private land today, fenced, overgrown, and silent once more. In the end, the Reborn Fellowship left behind no descendants, no survivors, and no clear explanation. Just a question that has haunted historians ever since. Were they deluded? Or did they truly believe they would wake again? Because some nights, when the fog drifts low across the valley, locals say you can still hear it, that faint rhythmic sound, like a congregation breathing in unison, waiting for dawn that never comes. When news of the fellowship's end broke, it spread through California like a ghost story retold around a dying fire. Small-town papers called it the resurrection cult mass suicide. Others labeled Silas Merrin a fraud, a madman, or a prophet gone wrong. But in the towns near the valley, the reaction was quieter, more personal, more uneasy. People didn't speak of it loudly in diners or church halls. They whispered about it at gas stations and grocery counters, eyes flicking to the door as if afraid the dead might overhear. Most had known one of the followers, a cousin, a neighbor, a friend who stopped writing home. And now all of them were gone. Families came to claim the bodies, though few could bring themselves to see them. One father who had lost his daughter to the fellowship stood before the sheriff's office and said only, "She believed she'd wake again. I hope she's right." He didn't cry. He simply turned and left, never returning to collect her remains. Local clergy tried to make sense of it. Reverend Tom Harlow of the nearby St. Anne's Church gave a sermon a week after the discovery, calling it a tragedy of faith misplaced. Yet even he admitted that something about the stillness of the victims, their serenity, unsettled him. "They did not die in fear," he told a journalist. "They died waiting, as if expecting someone to open the door." Doctors from Sacramento examined the bodies in the site, filing long reports filled with medical jargon: starvation-induced cardiac failure, dehydration, potential psychosis from isolation. But quietly, a few of them admitted the evidence didn't fully align. The body's varying states of preservation made no biological sense. A coroner from Fresno wrote in his notes, later leaked, certain muscular rigidity inconsistent with known time of death. Suggests synchronized movement or repositioning after death. That line alone fueled decades of speculation. Within months, the fellowship faded from public memory. The Great Depression deepened, and California had new tragedies to dwell on. But the story lingered in that part of the state, passed from one generation to another as a cautionary tale. Parents warned their children not to wander into the valley after dark. Teenagers dared each other to visit the ruins. Some historians revisited the case in the 1950s when American fascination with cults began to rise again. Professor Elaine Porter of Stanford published a paper titled "Death as Transition, the Reborn: Fellowship and the Culture of Despair," suggesting that the group reflected a deeper American hunger, the longing for control over mortality during a time of economic ruin and spiritual fatigue. She wrote, "The promise of resurrection is not inherently evil. What made the fellowship dangerous was its refusal to acknowledge death as final. They did not deny mortality, but they tried to domesticate it." Psychologists saw parallels with collective delusion and trauma bonding. Silas Merrin, they argued, wielded soft control, not through violence but by slowly redefining reality. He replaced fear of death with the comfort of inevitability, turning the unimaginable into a ritual. His followers didn't see themselves as dying. They believed they were crossing over. In later years, a few surviving relatives described the slow transformation of their loved ones before they vanished. One woman recalled her sister writing letters filled with joy at first, about peace, about renewal. But near the end, the tone changed. Her final note read, "If you hear singing at night, do not be afraid. It means we're close." Those who lived near the ruins long after the tragedy spoke of strange occurrences. The air colder near the foundations, candles refusing to stay lit, faint echoes of footsteps in the grass. Farmers who plowed too close claimed their tractors stalled. And one caretaker in the 1940s left after 3 nights, saying the silence pressed against the walls, but others approached it differently. For a small number of spiritualists in California's esoteric circles, Silas Merrin became almost a martyr, a symbol of mankind's ancient longing to transcend the flesh. They gathered at the site quietly each March 9th, the date of the fellowship's final gathering, and left offerings, lilies, old keys, folded scraps of paper with prayers written in Latin. Law enforcement tried to disband these groups, but they always returned. To them, the Reborn Fellowship wasn't a tragedy. It was unfinished work. By the late 20th century, the story resurfaced again in the public imagination. Journalists drew parallels between the Fellowship and later cult movements. Heaven's Gate, People's Temple, calling Merrin a prophet before his time. Yet unlike those later tragedies, his followers didn't die in panic or fear. They died in harmony, which only deepened the unease. What unsettled historians most wasn't the deaths themselves, but the absence of struggle. 31 people starving for weeks, no sign of restraint, no recorded dissent. Psychiatrists still debate whether mass hysteria alone can produce such quiet compliance. The only surviving physical evidence, the key around Silas's neck and the burned pages of the Gospel of Return, remains locked in a private archive at the California State Library. Researchers say the handwriting grows increasingly erratic in the final pages, but one phrase repeats over and over: "We will wake in the dawn that does not end." For many, that sentence became the Fellowship's defining legacy, a line between faith and madness that blurred so completely it could not be separated anymore, even now. Nearly a century later, the story still divides those who hear it. Was Silas Merrin a manipulative preacher feeding on despair? Or was he a man who believed so completely in resurrection that others followed him into the dark? No one knows for sure. But when locals pass that hill, fenced and empty, some still stop their cars and roll down the windows. They swear the air shifts, not a sound, not a whisper, but something close. As if beneath the soil, something still waiting remembers how to breathe. The night of March 9th, 1935 was colder than any Californian spring had a right to be. The San Joaquin Valley, usually damp and warm from the marsh air, had gone still, brittle, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Those who lived near the edge of the property later said they saw a strange, dull glow coming from the hill, not firelight, but something low and flickering, like heat trapped behind glass. Inside the chapel, 31 members of the Reborn Fellowship sat in perfect rows. No one spoke. They wore the same white garments, stitched from rough linen. At the front stood Silas Merrin, his voice low and rhythmic like a lullaby for the dying. He had been fasting for nearly 2 weeks, his cheeks hollowed, his eyes dark and almost luminescent. In his hands he held a silver bowl, filled not with water, but a pale liquid that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. He told them it was the final drink, the vessel of passage. Outside, the wind began to rise. The windows of the chapel rattled softly, as though the world beyond was reminding them that time still existed. Yet none of them moved. Each person bowed their head, whispering in unison the words Silas had written in his final sermon: "To sleep is to remember. To wake is to begin again." He walked slowly down the aisle, handing each follower a small clay cup. They lifted it together, drank without hesitation. There were no screams, no convulsions, just silence. Some clasped hands as they fell asleep. Others smiled faintly as though recognizing something only they could see. Witnesses from miles away later claimed to hear faint singing carried on the wind, 31 voices rising and fading into the night. But no one went to investigate. Not yet. Silas remained standing at the altar. He looked out over the rows of still bodies, his breathing uneven. He did not drink. Instead, he placed the empty bowl on the pulpit and reached for the old brass key that hung around his neck. He held it to the candle flame until the metal glowed red, then pressed it into his palm, searing his own flesh. The journal found later in the ruins recorded his final words in an unsteady hand: "If I must open the gate, then let me be the first to walk through." When searchers arrived days later, the scene was undisturbed. The doors were locked from the inside. Every candle had burned down to the wick. And at the front, near the altar, Silas Merrin lay beside the silver bowl, his hands folded neatly, his burned palm resting over his chest. No one could explain the condition of the bodies. They showed signs of life long after the estimated time of death: limbs supple, eyes clear. Even decomposition refused to follow nature's rhythm. It was as if time itself had slowed inside the chapel. Reporters flooded the town, hungry for something sensational. But the details were never released in full. Authorities sealed the area within days, citing biological safety concerns, a phrase that only deepened the mystery. The official cause of death, self-inflicted poisoning, did not account for everything. The toxicologist's report vanished from the state archive years later. In the weeks that followed, Strange phenomena were reported by those who guarded the property. Footsteps where there should have been none. Candles relit after being extinguished. A faint metallic scent lingering in the air, like copper or blood. One deputy refused to return after hearing what he described as a heartbeat under the floorboards. He said it pulsed once every few seconds, slow, rhythmic, human. The property was eventually sold, though no one ever built on it. Too many workers refused to stay after sunset. Machinery broke without reason, tools went missing, and one foreman swore he heard a voice whispering his name from the chapel ruins. In 1953, a group of amateur historians reopened the case, convinced that the fellowship had discovered something beyond mass delusion. They retrieved fragments of the journal, old photographs, and a handful of preserved bones. But within a month, their research was abruptly halted when two of the team members disappeared near the site. Their vehicle was found still running. Headlights pointed toward the ruins. Inside, investigators discovered a single page of notes left on the dashboard. On it, one of the missing researchers had written, "The key wasn't symbolic. It was meant to be used." No one ever determined what that meant. In the years that followed, the story was retold in whispers, then in books, then in documentaries that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism. But every retelling seemed to leave something out, as if the story itself resisted being remembered in full. Locals who live near the valley today still avoid the old road that leads to the site. They say their radios cut out when they drive past the turnoff. Cell signals vanish and static hums faintly through the speakers like a low, distant choir. The chapel is gone now, swallowed by weeds and rain. But the foundations remain, and sometimes, on nights when the fog rolls in thick from the river, the outline of the structure appears faintly in the mist, like a memory that refuses to die. People say if you stand at the edge of the ruins long enough, you might hear it. The sound of 31 voices humming softly in the dark, in perfect harmony, waiting for something only they believe will come, and somewhere, perhaps, Silas Merrin is still keeping his promise, still holding the key, waiting for the dawn that does not end. Nearly a century has passed since the Reborn Fellowship sealed themselves inside that wooden chapel on the edge of the valley, but the silence they left behind has never truly lifted. The building is gone, swallowed by time, by wind, by the soft creep of grass, but its absence carries a weight. You can feel it when you stand there, a strange pressure in the air, like the earth itself remembers what happened and refuses to let it go. The story has become a kind of folklore now. Farmers tell it to keep their children from wandering too far at night. Historians debate whether it was a religious tragedy or a psychological experiment gone wrong. Ghost hunters visit the ruins and leave with nothing more than static on their recorders and a coldness they can't explain. Yet, every so often someone finds something, a piece of pottery, a scrap of linen, a half-buried coin marked with the initials RF, and every time it starts again. The questions, the unease, the quiet fascination. What unsettles people most isn't what's known, it's what isn't. 31 people, led by a man who believed death was just another room to enter. No signs of fear, no resistance, no struggle. They didn't die as victims. They died as volunteers. In a world where faith and fear often collide, that kind of certainty is far more terrifying than violence. Psychologists today call it collective cognitive surrender, the moment when individuals stop thinking separately and merge into a single shared belief. It's happened in smaller ways throughout history, but never as cleanly, as peacefully, as it did with the Reborn Fellowship. It was, in its own haunting way, a perfect ending, and yet, there are details that refuse to fit neatly into scientific language. The uneven decay, the faint traces of warmth in corpses hours after discovery, the burned imprint of a key in Silas Merrin's palm, still visible even after preservation. None of it disproves science, but none of it rests easily within it either. For some, that's the part that matters. Not the poison, not the mass death, but the idea that maybe, for a single breath of time, those people believed they had touched something eternal. Local folklore says that sometimes, on certain cold mornings, a thin mist rolls down from the hill, spreading across the fields like smoke, and in it faintly there are shapes, rows of figures in white, standing still, heads bowed. The mist vanishes as quickly as it comes, leaving only the sound of the wind in the dry grass. Farmers who've seen it don't like to talk about it. One old man told a reporter in 1981, "It's not what you see that stays with you. It's what you feel leaving when it's gone." Even now, historians and spiritualists visit the site for different reasons. Some come to understand, some to exploit, and a few quietly to pray. They say the ground hums faintly beneath your feet if you stand still long enough, like a low vibration, like a heartbeat. But no matter how many theories are written, or how many documentaries try to solve the mystery, one truth remains constant. The Fellowship's story feels unfinished. Maybe that's why people still return to it. Generation after generation, not to learn but to remember. Because buried somewhere in the heart of that valley is a story about what happens when faith goes too far, when hope becomes hunger, and when the promise of eternity sounds sweeter than life itself. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying thing about the Reborn Fellowship is not that they died. It's that, in their final moments, they weren't afraid. And if fear is what separates us from them, what happens when we lose it too? That question lingers long after the story fades, long after the wind stops and the night grows still again. Because even now, in that lonely corner of California, there are those who claim that the air changes near the ruins, that it tightens, cools, and presses close, as if the ground beneath remembers a breath that was never quite exhaled. And somewhere, perhaps in a space between dream and memory, the Fellowship is still waiting, eyes closed, hands folded, listening for the sound of a door unlocking in the dark, a door that leads, not back to life, but forward into whatever comes after. And maybe, just maybe, it was never about resurrection at all. It was about return.